Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, the Wheel of Jobs decided that we play Pictomancer on the evening of January 1st. And this was quite a ridiculous set of duties. That said, for duty 1, we went to Urth's Fount against Odin. As a Pictomancer, being ranged, it isn't a bad idea to stand a bit away from other players, as Odin will every so often fire AoEs at some players, and these AoEs applies an attack speed slow, so by being a bit spread out, each AoE will only slow one person. Additionally, as a Pictomancer, being able to plan when you paint your motifs, as well as being somewhat flexible in when you spend them, gives you more space to burst things when it is needed. For instance, Mhach of the Ages can be held until you use your next Winged Muse. And because Living Muse can hold 2 charges at this level, you can sit on 1. Striking Muse gives you 30 seconds to spend the hammer stamps, so you can use it up to 20 seconds before you actually need them. This is just generally handy in a fight with intermissions with extra targets that need to be focused down, or fights with phases with DPS checks. Odin happens to be both of these things. So, for example, holding Mhach of the Ages and a palm or wing for when the spears come down, so one can be quickly dealt with, is a great idea. Holding the hammer time buff a bit for the same reason can really make short work of at least part of this section. A small note about the attack speed slow is that it can be removed with the Shuna. Whether it is actually worth the GCD for the healers definitely depends on how quickly they get to it, but this slow being 40% means it is kinda worth the trade of casting a Shuna as long as a slow of at least around 5 to 6 seconds is removed, and even removing it at 3 seconds left is a relatively small difference. Obviously, healers should remove the debuff on themselves first every time. Speaking of which, at one point during the fight, I got randomly rescued across the arena, and immediately after a Shunat, while the healer apologized. They even apologized again at the end of the duty. When I got yoinked, I simply assumed it was a misclick and that Ishuna was next to rescue, which it was, and moved on. Now, after the spear intermission, the next thing you can do as a Pictomancer is prepare for when Odin reaches around 15% HP, and that is where the final DPS check comes. In your average party, you shouldn't need to over-prepare for this, as it is perfectly beatable without prep. But just in case you have a weaker team, it isn't a bad idea to have a Mhach in the pocket and a Muse ready. And if Striking Muse aligns just right, that is also nice to bring. And because of how the fight is structured, there is really no need to rush until that 15% point. Indeed, the run went just fine and there were no particularly threatening points along the way. For duty 2, we went to throwing branches and giving titles. So I had 2 funny observations in this run. The first one is that it never occurred to me that the goblins will reset if you run too far, so when I noticed it happen, I assumed that was a strategy that I simply hadn't seen before. I also noticed that our dragoons slowly lagged behind, fighting through the goblins one at a time while the rest of us went straight for the boss. Once the boss went down is when I took a second to actually read the duty description. Eliminate all enemies. Whoops. Fortunately, as the Dragoon had been working on it all this time, they finished up shortly after the boss died. I'm not sure if there is an advantage to splitting up the team in some way here, but depending on the team composition, maybe sending the DPS forward to clear the boss while the tank cleaves down the large AoE stuff might actually be pretty efficient. Optimizing guild hasts, am I right? For duty 3, we went to Ifrit Extreme, and this fight, just in general, seems to devolve into total chaos extremely quickly. The core mechanics that cause this chaos are as follows. The tanks have to deal with the stacking suppuration debuffs from Ifrit's flamethrower, leading to somewhat random tank switching throughout the fight as the stacks climb. In the latter half of the fight, this gets even more confusing as Ifrit will chain 2 players together, which will always be the off-tank at the time, and a DPS, but would be almost anyone if there's no off-tank alive, and could also include the healers if the DPS are dead. But the way this gets confusing is that the chains require the players to stay close to minimize the effect. If the tanks needed to tank swap during these chains, they sometimes do, then the DPS just had to stand carefully at a weird angle so they don't get hit by the flamethrower cone, while also keeping the chain debuff at 1 or 2 stacks. On top of this, Ifrit effectively alternates Searing Winds on the 2 healers 20 seconds at a time, which is a debuff that pulses wide knockbacking AoE damage around the healer every few seconds, requiring the healer to stay far away from the rest of the group. When a tank is dead, this gets particularly exciting when you get chained to the healer with this debuff. And finally, for even more chaos, the nails, which come in waves of 4, 7 and then 13, with one extra big one among the 13. Each nail, when destroyed, does raid-wide damage and applies a very short-lived vuln stack, so breaking multiple nails in very quick succession can be lethal. And in the chaos of the fight, it is very easy for 2 or 3 nails to go down at the same time. Of course, because it isn't clear exactly how long you have to break the nails, players often feel compelled to rush them down. But once you figure out how the fight is supposed to go, it isn't too bad. That said, for our first attempt, a lot of chaos was happening, but overall, what really tired us out was that the tanks had some issues with the tank switching, which drained the healers of resources, burning out the team as a whole. On the second attempt, things were going better overall, but it was still clear we hadn't quite figured out the tank switching mechanic correctly, which caused Ifrit to get a lot of opportunities to rampage through the party as a whole. So, for the third attempt, I explained the separation mechanic and how the tanks can deal with it. Simultaneously, Treo, one of the healers, suggested specific spots for them to stand with Searing Winds. And so, for the third attempt, we reach the first nails very quickly and deal with them with 3 at once and then 1. The tanks seem to be switching as low as 2 separation stacks, as long as they don't have any stacks on themselves, which is excellent practice. Moments later, the second set of nails come down. We take them out as 2, then 3, then 1, and then 1, and still with 0 deaths. Only shortly after, the last set of nails come down. We start with 3 nails, which ends up killing Ananas, at the worst of times where Ilana has 4 separation stacks and should have been tagged out by now. We take out 2 more nails, which ultimately drop Zung, Psyche and SG. We take out 1 more nail, while I simultaneously deal with being chained to Talon with Searing Winds. 1 more nail as I get changed to Elena. We take out 2 more nails, wait out the debuff, and immediately take out 1 more, and then hurry to take out the last nail across the arena. By the time the phase is resolved, we have 2 DPS, 1 tank, and 2 healers alive. And Ifrit goes down with both Zung and Psyche still on the floor. It is incredible how well the fight went right up until the last nails phase, where everything went to chaos, but incredibly well done by everyone. For Duty 4, we went to Ravana Extreme, and look, SG from the Ifrit duty is also here. This fight is pretty wild as a Pictomancer, as both Prelude to Liberation and Actual Liberation represent perfect opportunities to paint motifs, enabling Pictomancer to burst while being able to take the non-damaging portion of their rotation with no target. Due to the sheer amount of damage we were doing, the butterfly phase was completely skipped. Just to clarify, I've skipped most of it before without a Pictomancer. For the final section, take note to step out to a wall for Pillars of Heaven, as it is both proximity damage and a knockback. What follows immediately after, the white marker, is a stack marker that hurts the walls, so there you would rather get into the center to stack with everyone. However, it seems it is barely survivable as long as at least 2 players are in the stack, although that might have been thanks to Karakoli. The mechanic after that, this red circle target marker, indicates who Ravana will use Serpanaka on, and it can be passed to other players, so optimally, simply hand it to a tank. They can live it easily. Then get behind as these Serpanakas are cones. Typically, once Swift Liberation starts casting, the fight is over, especially if it starts casting before he finishes casting multiple Serpanakas. A nice and quick run. For Duty 5, we went to Alexandria for a relatively normal run. I assume the tank was joking with the message about mitigation at the start. An interesting thing that came up is that the elephant before the first boss had about 80% HP left when my burst came up, so I decided to just throw it in there. And luckily, I suppose, it died just as my burst finished, so it didn't go to waste. In fact, over the course of the duty, I was able to use my burst on whatever we were looking at pretty effectively, almost exactly on cooldown. It did lead to some rather random timings, but more casts of the burst pushes through the duty faster. A quick reminder tip for Pictomancer damage in dungeons, and even duties in general, is to always try to only paint motifs mid-combat if you know you want to or have to spend them in that fight. In dungeons, this is mainly because once the fighting ends, you get the motifs effectively for free. In raids and trials, or final bosses of dungeons, the logic is instead that If you spend 4 seconds painting a starry motif, only for the boss to die before you get to use Starry Muse, you lost out on about 1 to 2 GCDs worth of damage. That, of course, does not apply if the motif was painted in a moment where there was no target anyway, but outside of that exception, waiting with painting a motif until it is a bit closer to time to use it can be helpful, so you only have to determine, will I be able to use Living Muse in 10 seconds, rather than, will I be able to use Living Muse in 40 seconds? Just food for thought. Case in point about painting mid-combat, the final boss has a short section between the intermission starting and after the intermission being finished where there is no target. I would say both are enough to paint one motif, but probably worth painting 2 in the first bit, so planning around that can be very effective. For duty 6, we are a 12-minute replacement in Worqor Zormor, and I can kind of see why someone left, as I met with a paladin soloing the second boss from around 25%. I would assume they had been at this for a while longer than that though. After the boss is finished, the paladin apologized for taking so long with that and suggested they should have just reset it in hindsight. I know that feeling. I didn't really mind though, but then again, I came in late, so maybe it was a lot more annoying for the rest of the team. Aside from that, the remainder of the duty went just fine. For the last boss, it is a very good idea to hold any instant cast options you have for the intermission with the orbs to pick up, although, in fairness, the damage buff is relatively minor per stack, both in the case that you don't get that much power from them, but neither does the boss. Every bit helps though. For duty 7, we went to A6N, Cup of the Sun, Alexandria. You know, the one with the 4 bosses one at a time. The one that tends to stand out is Brawler, and it is a specific mechanic too. When it holds out its hands, it is showing you what it is about to do. The notable ones are 1 and 2 lasers. 1 laser means tank buster, so the tank can simply take it, although the boss does add vulnerability stacks over the course of the fight, so optimally the tanks will do some tank switching to minimize that. Practically, they probably won't. If it is 2 lasers, then it is a line stack, and the tank should aim it at the raid so we all can take it together. In practice though, usually doesn't happen. Apparently, the boss can also show a drill which mostly just does some level of AoE damage. The particularly problematic one is of course the 2 lasers. Aside from this, each fight is pretty doable with whatever chaos happens to occur. For duty 8, we went to Leviathan Extreme and immediately a tank left, but the replacement we got was solid. We also had Treo from the Ifrit duty earlier. The main things you can do as a Pictomancer in this fight is to hold some burst for the Sahagins, especially the Wave Tooth, the one that casts Dreadstorm. A quick tip for tanks and melees is that the Wave Tooth can also be stunned, so stun it when it's about to finish casting Dreadstorm, or Dread Wash if it comes to that. Because Leviathan has so many parts in the fight where it is untargetable, this also enables a Pictomancer to ready their burst almost for free consistently. For the first wave of adds, the Wave Tooth does manage to put down Dreadstorm, but it is placed off in the side of the arena we don't need. The second wave of adds are also no issue. However, the tank rounding up the wave spumes end up dying to the push from Leviathan, spiraling the raid into total chaos trying to not die from the proximity AoEs, on top of being down a healer and DPS on top of that. While all of this chaos is resolving, Leviathan reaches below 20% HP and becomes invulnerable, which is a great opportunity to prepare burst for later. After the next push, we fight another Wave Tooth, but due to the dead DPS players, it is hard to get down in time, but Yazaros stuns it just before Dread Wash. To clarify, Dreadstorm puts down a circle that, if you step in it, causes you to run around in fear for like 10 seconds, which is usually certain death. It can even cause you to run back into it again in the duration. Dread Wash causes everyone to run around in fear for a few seconds, which usually wipes the raid. A weird twist here is that Dread Wash can be blocked with a barrier, but is certainly not the recommended way to solve it. With the Wave Tooth out of the picture, we finish up the fight. A solid, albeit quite chaotic run. For duty 9, we went to Ifrit hard, and I was reminded in this run that Ifrit is stunnable, meaning that you can just say nope when he tries to cast something inconvenient like eruptions. A useful thing to keep in mind as a Pictomancer is that he becomes untargetable once or twice throughout the fight, which are great times to paint motifs. And finally for duty 10, we are an instant replacement in Weeping City of Mhach. When we were closing in on Mr. Megadeth himself, someone in the raid asked if anyone needed a refresher on this fight, and a first timer specifically requested not getting any information, which was respected, so no information was given. For those of you who actually want to know, at certain points in the fight, the boss casts Megadeth, which kills you, shockingly, unless you are zombified to some extent. The green AoEs that appear on the floor throughout the fight will grant you partial zombification, which makes you able to survive Megadeth. However, if you stand in 2 overlapped green circles, it will fully zombify you, which is bad. Another mechanic that tends to catch players are these red triangles. I usually call them friendship Doritos. To resolve them correctly, stand near another person with a red triangle marker. If you do, nothing happens. Otherwise, you take a lot of damage. This is also the duty with the Ozma fight, and here I have 2 tips. The first one is to keep an eye on what shape Ozma turns into when it starts going crazy. Pyramid form means a large line AoE is cast through the main bridges, so get off them. In this mode, it also applies Acceleration Bomb, which you resolve by doing nothing when the die hits 0. I recommend stopping all action and either sheathing your weapon or untargeting the boss when the die hits 1 or even 2, to be sure. Cube form means a donut AoE will hit the circular bridges connecting the 3 main bridges, and orbs will appear and swirl the arena. These orbs must be soaked, preferably by a tank. If they're not soaked, they will hit someone randomly later. During this form, Ozma's auto attacks will also be line AoEs. Finally, during sphere form, Ozma will put huge purple spread markers on players. These should be spread out around the arena. You can place 2 on each small bridge, but don't get too close. You can also put 1 in the back end of your own main bridge. If 2 are placed too closely, it does massive raid-wide damage. Also, as various mechanics hit players in teams throughout, make sure for the entire fight to hang out with your alliance specifically. Overall, this duty went quite well, but we did have quite a lot of chaos, including beating the final boss, Calofisteri, by a hair. Quite a wild set of duties with so many extremes and actually more challenging duties. The most impressive part being how easily we managed to cleave through them all. I'm not sure what I would have done if we didn't have solid healers and tanks in the extremes, since, as a Pictomancer, all I can do is kill things fast. That said, we started this set with 526 duties cleared and finished with 536. Also, at this point, the Wheel of Jobs has 10 DPS, 1 tank and 1 healer, so 5 out of 6 chance of drawing a DPS. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, while Holy and White is considered a minuscule damage loss to use just for the sake of using it on single target at max level, with just 2 targets, it becomes worthwhile to use. As such, once you start to accumulate some white paint in a dungeon, it is an excellent choice to use at pretty much any time where you see at least 2 enemies.